Alright guys, in the last video I teased that I lowered my car, so yeah, here's how we did it. Helping with the install is going to be Thomas. You guys remember Thomas, right? Alright, so before we get started, I just want to make this very clear. We're not doing this the proper way. This is car noob, which means shortcuts, which means follow at your own risk. Also, I curse occasionally. And with that being said, we've got a lot to cover, so let's get started. First, we need to loosen up the lug nuts on each wheel. Next, open up your hood and find your strut. That's this thing right here. We've got two of them. And around each strut are 3 nuts. Just go ahead and take those out. And for our install, we're using a strut rod nut socket. This allows us to bypass the socket with an Allen key to hold the strut in place, so that we can remove the nut on top of the socket. The front uses a 6mm Allen key, while the rear is 5mm. Now, if you don't have access to one of these, that's okay, because seriously, it took me fucking an hour and a half to even just find the name of this. Anyways, there's another way to do this without one. Just take a regular socket, the 17mm for the front and 14mm for the rear, and hold it with vice grips. Now make sure you've got a good hold on it, and this will essentially do the exact same thing. But if you do it this way, you must loosen the strut nut first. So once you've removed both nuts from each strut, you can start jacking up the car. Now let me elaborate a little bit on what we just did. Normally when changing out your springs, you'd want to remove the strut first, then remove the nut on top. This would cause the spring to release all its pressure at once, which could be potentially dangerous. So that's why you'd get spring compressors to hold the spring while you remove the nut. In our case though, we don't have spring compressors, and no one wanted to drive down to AutoZone to rent some. So what we're doing is removing the nut while the strut is still on the car, and having the car be our compressor. Jacking it up slowly will release the pressure on the springs. Now remember, car noob, shortcuts. Follow at your own risk. Now we're using jack stands to be on the safe side, since we'll semi be working underneath the car. And once you've jacked up your car, go ahead and take off the wheels, then move on to the wheel well. Let's start by removing this 17mm nut here. After that, remove the two 19mm here and here. Also remove this clip to the front of the strut shown here. Then remove the brake line here, which is a 12mm. After that's out, remove the other bolts at the bottom of the strut, and then you should be able to remove it. Also note that going to the dry lake bed with your race car does have its consequences. Now for this video, I decided to go with the RSR lowering springs because, so since there weren't any instructions, we're not entirely sure about this part, but for most kits they come with a shorter bump stop. We didn't get one, so we're cutting the stock bump stop. Once you're done with that, go ahead and start reassembling back together your strut, this time with your new spring instead of the old one. You don't need to fully tighten your nut all the way just yet, just enough to keep it all together. Now just put it back on the car. Line up the 3 bolts to their correct holes and tighten the nuts to keep it in place. Finish putting back together everything in reverse order of how you remove them. Move back up top and finish tightening up the strut. Repeat the same steps to the passenger side and go ahead and put your wheels back on. Congratulations, you just finished lowering the front end of your car. Now, depending on how low your car is now, you might be only able to use the jack 80% of the way. If that's the case, you should be able to use the jack that's in the trunk for the rest of the way. Now let's move on to the back. Make sure you've removed everything from the trunk. Next, remove the mat and this piece right here. Then start removing all the clips around the liner and take that out. On the driver's side though, you need to unclip this wiring here. Keep everything in a safe spot because dropping it means that there's an 80% chance you'll never see it again. Trust me. Just trust me on this. So since we didn't have a strut rod and nut socket the correct size for the rear, we're going to be going with the second method. And once again, in case you missed it, car noob, shortcuts, not proper, YOLO. Because race car. Start with your 14mm socket and start loosening the nut on top of the strut. Then grab your socket along with vice grips and your 5mm Allen key. And just like the front, remove the strut nuts and the nuts surrounding them. Once you have all that removed, go ahead and start jacking up the rear. Put on the jack stands and then start removing your wheels. For the rear, it's a little different, but start by removing these 3 bolts here, here, and here. Once those are out, you should be able to remove the strut. Just like the front, replace the spring, cut the bump stop, and put it all back together. You can loosen this bolt here. It'll help put the strut back in. You don't have to remove it, but just remember to tighten it back up when you're done. Next, put the strut back onto the car, align the bolts to the correct holes, and put the nuts on. Repeat the steps on the other side, and once that's done, you can go ahead and replace all the liner, mats, and clips. And that's how you install lowering springs. Now you can lower your car back down and go post up on Instagram and Bookface about how you're stance now and all about that low life. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and or comment down below. Also, if you have any suggestions on something you'd like to see, please let me know. And as always, thanks for watching.